The Arctic Ocean has always been one of Earth's last great mysteries. Vast, frozen, and largely unexplored by modern standards, it stretches across the top of our planet like a silent guardian of secrets. But what lies beneath that frozen ceiling is far more chilling than anyone in the intelligence community wanted to admit. In the winter of 2024, as international tensions continued to simmer between superpowers, the U.S. Navy made a discovery that would send shockwaves through Pentagon corridors and diplomatic channels worldwide. What they found wasn't just a single wreck, a single facility, or a single piece of Cold War debris. What they uncovered was an entire graveyard of Soviet-era nuclear secrets, hidden, abandoned, and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The USS Connecticut, one of the Navy's most advanced Seawolf-class fast-attack submarines, had been assigned to conduct what appeared to be a routine intelligence-gathering mission beneath the Arctic ice. These operations weren't uncommon. The US Navy had been quietly monitoring Russian activity in the Arctic for years, tracking movements, listening for signals, and gathering data through advanced sonar systems that could detect the faintest whisper of mechanical activity in the ocean depths. But as the Connecticut moved silently through the darkness beneath nearly 700 meters of ancient ice, something unusual began to register on their instruments. Heat signatures, thermal anomalies, multiple radiation readings that shouldn't exist in those coordinates. The crew immediately understood what this meant. They weren't looking at just one anomaly, they were looking at a pattern. Multiple sources of radioactivity scattered across the seabed in a specific geographical area. The tactical operations officer on the submarine relayed the information back to Naval Submarine Base New London, where analysts began pulling up satellite imagery, historical records, and decades of accumulated intelligence on Soviet-era naval operations. What emerged from that analysis was a nightmare scenario that had been lurking beneath the Arctic ice for decades, largely forgotten and completely undocumented in any public record. The Soviets, during their reign as a superpower, had engaged in one of the most reckless environmental crimes in modern history. Throughout the Cold War and into the 1982nd, as their empire crumbled and resources became scarce, Soviet naval commanders made a decision that would echo through the decades. They began dumping nuclear waste directly into the Arctic Ocean. But this wasn't just casual dumping of contaminated water. We're talking about entire submarines filled with spent nuclear fuel. We're talking about reactor vessels, radioactive containers, and the hazardous materials that were deliberately scuttled, sent to the bottom of the ocean to dispose of the radioactive problem without the massive expense of proper decontamination and disposal. One of the most significant discoveries in this underwater graveyard was the Lichter 4, a vessel that had been deliberately sunk in 1988. For over 30 years, this ship had been sitting on the Arctic seabed, its exact location unknown to modern authorities. It wasn't listed in any public records. It wasn't catalogued in Soviet-era inventories. It simply vanished. But the USS Connecticut's instruments had found it. The Lichter 4 wasn't just carrying radioactive waste. It was carrying reactor vessels torn from a Soviet nuclear submarine called the K-22. Inside the ship were 146 containers of solid radioactive waste, all of it sealed, but slowly degrading in the freezing darkness of the Arctic deep. This discovery triggered an immediate response. Within weeks, Russian authorities themselves mounted their own expedition. The research vessel Academic Iofe, equipped with advanced underwater remotely operated vehicles and cutting-edge gamma spectrometers, descended into the Bay of Currents to verify what the Americans had found. What they discovered confirmed the nightmare. Not only was the Lichter 4 there, but they also located the Nickel barge, another sunken vessel, carrying approximately 580 tons of radioactive waste. The barge had been missing for so long that its exact location had become something of a maritime ghost story. Until now. But the Lichter 4 and the nickel barge weren't the only discoveries waiting in the Arctic depths. As the US Navy continued its investigation and as international agencies began coordinating their efforts to map this underwater radioactive landscape, they found something else. Something that made the nuclear waste look like a minor environmental footnote. They found evidence of an enormous, sophisticated, and completely secret military surveillance system that Russia had been building in the Arctic for over a decade. This network, known as Project Harmony, was unlike anything the Western intelligence agencies had fully understood. It wasn't a single facility. It wasn't a single submarine base. It was an entire underwater infrastructure, a semicircular barrier of surveillance equipment stretching from Murmansk all the way to Franz Josef Land, constructed on the seabed at depths reaching nearly 3,000 meters. The system consisted of hundreds of miles of cables, thousands of sensors, sophisticated hydrophones, and drone-like vehicles, all working in concert to create what essentially amounted to an underwater surveillance net. Russia had been quietly acquiring advanced Western technologies, many purchased through shell companies and opaque financial networks from Europe, the United States, and Japan. They had assembled all of this technology into a single, unified system designed to do one thing and one thing only: detect NATO submarines. The strategic implication was staggering. Russia was building an early warning system, an underwater fence that would allow their own nuclear submarines to move undetected, while simultaneously being able to detect any NATO submarine entering their claimed Arctic territory. This was about power projection. This was about the coming struggle for Arctic resources as global warming continued to melt the ice and open new shipping routes and access to oil and natural gas reserves that had been locked beneath ice for millennia. The US Navy, through its sophisticated signal intelligence and sonar analysis, had essentially mapped the entire Harmony network. They understood its architecture, its capabilities, its weaknesses. But what shocked officials at the highest levels of the Pentagon was the realization that Russia had been building this system right under their noses, and despite decades of advanced surveillance satellites and submarine-based intelligence gathering, the full scope of the project hadn't been appreciated until now. The timing of these discoveries created a complex diplomatic situation. Russia knew that the Americans knew about Project Harmony. The Russians also knew that their own expedition to map the nuclear graveyard would be watched, analyzed, and discussed in intelligence briefings from Washington to Brussels. But there was something else, something that made Russian officials deeply uncomfortable. The discovery of the nuclear waste sites, the revelation of the surveillance network, and the ongoing thaw of Arctic ice due to climate change had created a ticking clock. The K-27 submarine, for instance, was sitting in the Kara Sea at a depth of about 75 meters. This wasn't just any submarine. It had been one of the Soviet Navy's most experimental vessels, equipped with liquid metal-cooled reactors that used the lead bismuth alloy, a design that had proven to be dangerously unstable. Back in 1968, during what was supposed to be a routine voyage, the K-27 experienced a catastrophic reactor accident. More than 140 crew members were exposed to massive amounts of radiation. 9 of them died. The Soviet Navy, faced with a crippled submarine that was too dangerous to repair and too radioactive to maintain, made the decision to scuttle it. They deliberately sank it in 1981, hoping that the Arctic depths would keep it isolated, contained, and safely away from human populations. But the Arctic isn't as isolated as the Soviets had hoped. Climate change was warming these waters. The current patterns were shifting. Scientific models were beginning to suggest that the protective barrier the cold had provided was weakening. The hull of the K-27 was deteriorating. It was only a matter of time, perhaps decades, perhaps less, before the reactor compartments began leaking radiation into the wider Arctic ecosystem. The K-27 contained approximately 800 kilograms of spent nuclear fuel. The potential for environmental catastrophe was real, present, and undeniable. Then there was the K-159. This submarine had sunk more recently, in 2003, while being towed for dismantling near Kildin Island. It went down in approximately 250 meters of water, killing 9 crew members in the process. The incident had been handled quietly, investigated perfunctorily, and largely forgotten by the international community. But it was part of the same pattern, Soviet and then Russian negligence regarding the handling of nuclear material. It was part of a legacy of dangerous decisions made in the name of Soviet might and then inherited by the Russian Federation. What shocked officials most about the US Navy's discovery wasn't just the existence of these nuclear wrecks. It wasn't even the revelation of Project Harmony, as sophisticated as that system was. What truly disturbed the Pentagon and policymakers in Washington was the realization of how much the Arctic had become a domain of great power competition and how little effective international cooperation existed to manage the environmental hazards that came with that competition. The Russians, for their part, had launched their own response. In an effort to regain the initiative and to demonstrate that they were taking the nuclear waste problem seriously, the Russian government announced plans to begin recovering the K-27 and K-159 submarines from the Arctic seabed. The estimated cost was staggering, approximately 24.4 billion rubles, which in 2024 money was roughly equivalent to several $100 million. The project was supposed to begin in 2026, with actual recovery operations starting in 2027. It was a tacit admission that the Soviet-era dumping campaign had created an environmental time bomb that could no longer be ignored. But here's where the situation became even more complicated. Project Harmony, the surveillance network, was still operational. It was still functioning. Even as Russian officials were publicly addressing the nuclear waste crisis, they were simultaneously maintaining and potentially expanding the very system that was designed to maintain military dominance in the Arctic. The US Navy's discovery had exposed a fundamental contradiction in Russian strategy. The country was simultaneously trying to position itself as a responsible steward of Arctic resources while maintaining an aggressive military posture in the region. The implications for international relations were significant. NATO was already concerned about Russian military buildup in the Arctic. The deployment of new combat icebreakers, the expansion of Russian military bases, and the militarization of Russia's northern fleet had been watched with growing alarm by Western defense officials. The revelation of Project Harmony added another layer to those concerns. It showed that Russia wasn't just expanding its military presence, it was creating the infrastructure for a sustained, sophisticated, and technologically advanced military advantage in a region that was becoming increasingly important geopolitically. The global response to these discoveries was fragmented and complicated. The European Union, particularly countries with Arctic territories like Norway and Finland, found themselves in a difficult position. On one hand, they were concerned about the environmental hazards posed by Russia's underwater nuclear graveyard. On the other hand, they were aware that openly confronting Russia about these issues could escalate already tense geopolitical relations. The International Maritime Organization began preliminary discussions about establishing new protocols for addressing radioactive wreckage in international waters, but progress was slow and consensus was elusive. Every nation had its own interests, its own strategic calculations, and its own reasons for either pushing for action or maintaining diplomatic silence. China, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. As climate change continued to open Arctic shipping routes, the prospect of shorter routes between Europe and Asia through the northwest and northeast passages became increasingly viable. Chinese state-owned enterprises began investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, icebreaker technology, and cold weather shipping capabilities. The discovery of Russia's surveillance network actually reinforced a strategic reality that Beijing had already understood. The Arctic was becoming a domain where military capabilities and technological superiority would determine geopolitical influence. China began accelerating its own Arctic development plans, partnering with Russia on some projects while simultaneously developing independent capabilities that would allow it to operate freely in these waters regardless of what surveillance systems were in place. For the United States Navy, the discovery of Project Harmony represented both a problem and an opportunity. The immediate problem was the existence of a sophisticated surveillance system designed to detect American submarines. The Navy's entire Arctic strategy was built on the principle of undetected operation, the ability to move through these waters silently, gathering intelligence and maintaining a strategic deterrent without being observed. Project Harmony potentially compromised that advantage, but the discovery also represented an opportunity. Now that the system had been identified and mapped, American engineers and strategists could begin developing countermeasures. They could design new operational patterns that exploited any gaps in the Russian network. They could develop electronic warfare capabilities designed to confound or disable the surveillance system if a conflict ever escalated to that point. They could, in essence, adapt and overcome. The United Kingdom and Canada, both countries with significant Arctic territories, began coordinating more closely with American intelligence agencies. NATO, as an institution, started formal discussions about developing an Arctic strategy that went beyond simple military presence and actually addressed the environmental and security challenges that these discoveries had revealed. For Canada in particular, the revelations about Project Harmony carried special significance. Much of Russia's surveillance network was positioned in ways that would allow it to monitor not just Russian Arctic territory but also Canadian waters and the approaches to Canadian ports. This was a direct challenge to Canadian sovereignty, or at least to Canada's unchallenged control of its own Arctic domain. What made the situation even more complex was the question of what to do about the nuclear waste. The discovery of the Lichter 4, the nickel barge, the K-27, and the K-159 had revealed a catastrophic environmental liability that no single nation could solve alone. The radioactive materials were in international waters, technically, though Russia controlled the surrounding area. Any significant operation to recover or contain these materials would require international cooperation, significant financial resources, and expertise that Russia itself was struggling to demonstrate. The Russian Federation had announced recovery plans, but the historical record suggested that Russian follow-through on such ambitious projects was inconsistent at best. Some scientists began warning that waiting too long could be dangerous. The Arctic Ocean, while cold, wasn't frozen in time. Current patterns, though slow, were moving radioactive materials away from the dive sites. The deterioration of submarine hulls and barge structures was accelerating as metal fatigue continued and as the slightly warmer waters began to take their toll. If the K-27 suddenly lost structural integrity and its reactor compartments were breached, the consequences could be catastrophic. A slow leak of radioactivity over decades was bad, but a sudden, massive release could poison fish stocks, contaminate the Arctic food chain, and create a health crisis for indigenous peoples who depended on Arctic seafood as a dietary staple. The indigenous Sami people of northern Scandinavia, who had lived in and around the Arctic for thousands of years, suddenly found themselves at the center of international discussions about radioactive waste and environmental protection. Their traditional hunting and fishing grounds could be affected by contamination from these underwater dumps. Their way of life, which had persisted through centuries of colonial pressure and cultural suppression, now faced a threat that was literally invisible and impossible to guard against. Environmental groups began raising the alarm about the potential impact on Arctic ecosystems, on reindeer herds, on fish populations, and on the broader biodiversity of one of Earth's most fragile regions. But even as the international community grappled with these challenges, the U.S. Navy's discovery of Project Harmony continued to be the primary focus of strategic discussions. The surveillance network represented a more immediate and pressing military concern than the slowly degrading nuclear waste. American submarine captains operating in the Arctic now had to assume that they were being monitored. Their tactics, their movements, their patterns of operation, all of these had to be adjusted based on the new understanding of Russian surveillance capabilities. The tactical implications were significant. The strategic implications were even more so. For years, American strategic doctrine had relied on the concept of undetected presence. The idea was that American submarines could move through the world's oceans, particularly in sensitive areas, without being detected, which meant that the enemy could never be sure whether a particular American submarine was present in a given location. This uncertainty created a strategic advantage. An adversary couldn't plan with certainty. They couldn't know if they were being observed. But Project Harmony threatened to change that calculation. If Russia could reliably detect American submarines in Arctic waters, then American strategic uncertainty became Russian strategic certainty. That was a significant shift in the balance of power. The U.S. Navy began developing new operational procedures specifically designed to counter Project Harmony. Some of these were tactical adjustments, new routes, new speeds, new patterns of movement that might exploit gaps in the Russian surveillance network. Others were technological, the development of decoys, the use of noise-making devices, the exploitation of acoustic properties of the Arctic waters that might confound Russian sensors. Still others were strategic, the development of new policies about how often American submarines would operate in the Arctic and in what configurations. What emerged from the Pentagon's strategic analysis was a clearer picture of a world that was fundamentally changing. The Arctic, once a relatively quiet backwater of geopolitical competition, was becoming a critical arena for great power competition. Climate change was opening access to resources and new shipping routes. Technology was making it possible for nations to operate in these harsh waters with greater effectiveness. Military capabilities were being developed and deployed at an accelerating pace. And environmental hazards, both natural and human-created, were becoming more difficult to manage and contain. Russian officials, faced with all of this attention and scrutiny, adopted a posture of controlled deflection. Yes, they acknowledged, there had been nuclear dumping during the Soviet era. But that was in the past. Russia was committed to addressing these environmental challenges. Russia had announced recovery operations. Russia was taking responsibility. As for Project Harmony, Russian spokespeople simply denied any special significance. The surveillance network was merely a scientific and environmental monitoring system, they claimed. It was not a military installation, despite its clearly military characteristics and capabilities. It was designed to gather oceanographic data and to monitor the health of Arctic ecosystems. This was transparent misdirection, of course, but it provided diplomatic cover for a system that Russia had no intention of dismantling or disabling. The complexity of the situation meant that in practice, very little immediate action was taken. Diplomatic channels remained open. Discussions continued. International organizations drafted proposals and white papers. But concrete action, the actual recovery of sunken submarines, the deployment of containment measures around the radioactive dump sites, the confrontation of Russia over Project Harmony, all of this remained in the realm of discussion rather than implementation. The geopolitical situation was too delicate, the potential for escalation too high, and the international consensus too weak. What the discovery did accomplish, however, was to shift the perspective of strategic planners, military theorists, and policymakers around the world. The Arctic was no longer a peripheral concern. It was a frontline domain of competition. The environmental stakes were real. The military implications were significant. The technological competition was accelerating. And the stakes for getting this right, for managing both the environmental hazards and the military competition in a way that didn't lead to catastrophic conflict or environmental disaster, were higher than most people realized. The USS Connecticut, the submarine that had made the initial discovery, returned from its patrol with a massive collection of data, recordings, and intelligence that would be analyzed for years. The crew members who had participated in the mission were debriefed extensively and sworn to secrecy, as was standard practice with classified intelligence operations. But rumors of the discovery leaked out, as they often do, and eventually made their way into the public domain through journalists, think tank analysts, and former intelligence officials who felt that the public had a right to know about threats to the Arctic environment. The Russian government, aware that the secret was out, eventually acknowledged the general outlines of what had been discovered. A state television news program aired a segment about the recovery efforts that would be undertaken. Scientists from the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute were interviewed about the challenges involved. Officials from the Russian Ministry of Natural Resources discussed the government's commitment to addressing the environmental legacy of the Soviet era. It was a classic example of Russian information strategy, acknowledging what couldn't be denied while simultaneously controlling the narrative and managing the implications. What's particularly fascinating about this entire episode is what it reveals about the nature of modern geopolitical competition. The discoveries under the Arctic ice didn't lead to military conflict. They didn't even lead to a diplomatic crisis in the traditional sense. Instead, they revealed a world where competition was multifaceted, where military, technological, environmental, and strategic concerns were all intertwined, and where the actions of the past, the reckless decisions made decades ago by Soviet planners, continue to have consequences and implications for the present and future. The Arctic ice was melting, revealing not just the physical artifacts of the Cold War, but also the ongoing nature of great power competition in the 21st century. For observers and analysts, the discoveries served as a reminder that beneath the surface of international relations, below the headlines about trade negotiations and diplomatic summits, there was a constant, quiet struggle for advantage. Nations were positioning themselves for future competition over resources, over territory, over strategic influence. The surveillance systems being deployed on the ocean floor were just one manifestation of this broader competition. The environmental hazards created by decades of negligence were another. And the struggle to maintain technological superiority, strategic advantage, and military readiness in an increasingly complex and contested domain was perhaps the most fundamental aspect of all. The story of the US. Navy's discovery of Russia's Arctic secrets is ultimately a story about the world we live in, a world where climate change is reshaping geography and geopolitics, where technology is enabling competition in domains that were previously inaccessible, where the legacy of the past continues to create challenges for the present, and where nations are jockeying for advantage in ways that are often invisible to the general public but profoundly consequential for global security and stability. As the Arctic continues to transform, as the ice continues to melt, and as new secrets and challenges continue to emerge from beneath the frozen surface, the lessons from these discoveries will become increasingly relevant. The U.S. Navy's Connecticut and the intelligence agencies that analyzed its findings had pulled back a curtain, revealing a domain of competition that is likely to become even more significant in the years and decades to come. The nuclear waste buried on the Arctic seafloor, the surveillance systems designed to monitor submarine movements, the competition for resources and influence. All of these are pieces of a larger puzzle that geopolitical strategists, military planners, and policymakers around the world are working to understand and navigate. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what makes this discovery truly shocking. It's not just what was found beneath the Arctic ice, it's what that discovery tells us about the future of global competition and about the stakes involved in the struggle for dominance and control in this emerging domain.